There was no organized games or sports or anything organized. So we did our own thing. Visitation was pretty open. For example, you didn't have to be invited into somebody's home. You didn't even knock when you went there. To see the door open and 6 kids walk in and line up inside the door, not saying a word, just watching everybody there. And then eventually, one of them would open the door and they'd all march out again. Not a word spoken between them. You ask them their name, they might give it to you, and you may not understand it, but they'd give it to you. And that was it. So that was kind of a way of life. I had a next door neighbor, for example, and fences were common in those days because you didn't fence animals in, you fenced them out. So you put up fences to keep the sheep out of your garden, for example. You put up other fences. Horses were running loose in the summer because they were only used in the winter. So they were running loose, so you put fences up to keep them out of your, we called it garden. It was the yard, really. And we'd hear them in the night, clop, 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 horses trotting along the road, and we'd be scared to death. As little kids, we thought they were going to break into the house. And anyway, then nothing happened that way, but it went on. So it got to the point where we looked forward to seeing horses in harness. And we had a store, of course, in Southport. And so that was a major gathering point, both for shopping. Gooseberry Cove was 1 mile away. Butter Cove was another mile beyond that. So in those days, to walk 2 miles was not a big deal. So you just walked everywhere you went. And I remember myself going to Gooseberry Cove to pick up the mail. And you just took it for granted. Around that time in my early years, the first radio appeared. And strangely enough, a next door neighbor, because there was a company from St. John's called Great Eastern Oil, and they sold batteries operated on a dry cell power pack. And Wilfred Avery, next door, listened to the radio quite a lot. I was interested in books and history and so on. So we have a lot of conversations. We talked on similar lines, so I enjoyed Wilfred for many years. The job of the teacher in those days was mainly to maintain discipline in the school, because right from the beginning you had a book and you learned to read from that book. You learned your letters and then you learned to read. Laddie was the dog and Snow was the cat. So that was the earliest creatures that you learned about. The teacher in the morning would say what grade, what you had to do. And for example, grade 3 may have spelling. So they lined up across in front of the teacher's desk, and the teacher would give words, and each one, if you were at the head of the class, if you didn't spell it right, you went to the foot of the class. And the next person would get the chance at it, and if they got it right, they stayed at the head of the class. So that was the lowest grade. And then you went to a reading where the teacher would look over your shoulder while you read. And the rest of the kids, I don't remember how they dealt with these little kids doing their thing on exercises and reading and so on. But that's the way it worked. That's a school picture. That's me, the tallest one in the bunch. In front of me is Julie Seward. Dick Seward's son is Joe Seward, who we're communicating with. So that's his father. And there's Alan, my best friend, who died at the age of 14. And in front of him, Ethel Lambert's daughter of him, Nina Lambert. And that's Will Balsam. That's Marjorie. And this is Lindy Lambert. So I think that's his sister and an older brother. The way the system worked, and it was kind of interesting with the name, up to grade 8 was normal school. And it wasn't called normal school, it was just school, period. Grade 9, 10, and 11 were CHE, Council of Higher Education. Grade 9, Council of Higher Education. But that was controlled by the Department of Education of Newfoundland. So you had to write CHE exams when you got to grade 9 and from them for the 3 years. There was a lot of kids dropped out before that. So there was a limited number, probably, I think you could say in about 6 communities, and they were Anglican and United was 2, and Salvation Army. There were 3 different ones. I think they all came together, and Pentecostal. And the grade 9ers went to a central location. Like this year it's going to be Gooseberry Cove. So from the whole southwest arm, all the way up to Long Beach, the kids who were there came there and boarded there for a week to write their exams. And then, of course, grade 10 and grade 11. And it was a different place. 1 year it was in Southport, 1 year it was in Heartsease Beach, Heartsease, and 1 year it was in Hatchet Cove. You went swimming. That was the only activity in the summer, and that would only be July and August. A lot of the kids had nothing to do. They had to carry wood in, carry water, because nobody had wells in their houses. We were the only place in Southport, I think, that had an indoor well. So you had to bring water, and everybody had a barrel, like a 30-gallon barrel, and that was the water barrel. So you brought buckets of water and dumped in the barrel and used from that. With the hoop, yeah, because that kept the buckets away from your leg. And so they walked along. Everybody, there were two main brooks. One was down in front of our house. It flowed in there. So everybody walked there to get the water. So that was a chore that kids had to do, but that was limited because generally that went to the bigger brother or the bigger sister. So the little kids just played.
Yeah.
Had games and invented games that. That's my Aunt Mary. That's my father's sister, who owned the first store. She had a fairly good business that my father ended up buying from her, and she moved to St. John's, I believe. That's our wharf standing out there. And in behind here, used to call it a factory, because downstairs, it was where you processed fish, split fish. There was also storage space there for salt, molasses, and one part of it was only in upstairs, because there was a walkway went underneath that, going out to the wharf, which is this wharf right here, because that was a large wharf. The store originally was part of the house that I was born in, and that was the family home. It was all trading. You fished, you bought the salt that you needed and the gasoline you needed, and all that charged it. And it was written down in a scribbler, an exercise book, the name and what you bought and how much it was. And that was Mom's job, because Dad couldn't write, because he only had 2 years education or something. But he had the brain for business. So he bought the store from her, and then very soon afterwards, he built onto it, and then eventually tore that down and built a store there. Now, I'm not sure where the family, they lived in that store, and around that time, I think he probably built the house, present house, first, and then used what later became the living room in that house as the store. So, except for the stuff that was on the wharf, salt beef, salt pork, molasses, gas, anything like that. Like, I remember the start of the war. As a matter of fact, I was, quote unquote, helping my father. And I was 8 years old, of course. I was helping him spread fish on the flake to dry, because he kept his hand in some with the fishing, even though his main sense of livelihood was the business. And Jay Avery was going by, who was right there, you know, the length of this building away. So Dad called out to him and said something about, "Jabe, you get your gun, you can go to war now." He said, "Yeah, they pay $30 a month and found." That was an expression. And found meant your clothes was found and your groceries and where you lived and so on. The Hubert Bryan, which was the schooner that I remembered being on. That one later, Dad sold that one after my uncle drowned, and he went years without one. And then he bought a reconditioned a boat that was rebuilt already, partly, and he bought it, basically the hull, and had it refitted, masts put in it and sails, and it spent a lot of time tied up, because for when Dad wanted to ship fishery products to St. John's, they loaded it on the Sarah Francis, and he had, for a couple of years, I remembered Henry Thomas, Mother would know, Henry Thomas and Dick Seward with the crew, with Dad, and I was a little bit of a gopher. You know, I was just I don't know, I was a teenager, I guess. And the Sarah Francis got to be worn out. It wasn't measuring up for what Dad wanted it for. He wanted to extend the use of it because at that time the government was offering a rebate on any vessel that you built for the fishery. So that wasn't a hard commitment to make. Fishing Labrador, it was not hard to get a crew. So Dad had the Hubert, was to be the Hubert and Gordon. As a matter of fact, Mary painted the name on it. And when he went to register it, he couldn't register it. There was already a vessel named that. So she changed it to the Hubert G. Smith. And that was the Hubert G. Just went by Hubert G. Everybody called it. Yeah. That's the one that I spent 2 years on, fishing in Labrador and carrying freight to and from St. John's. Obviously, with a full load, we're about to leave Labrador to come home because the engine was running. I could see the water exhaust pump.
But your father was the captain?
Initially. Okay. He made the first trip, captain. Then he hired Eli Tucker, who was a former dragger fisherman, fished the Grand Banks in a dragger, which was a challenging job, and Eli fit right in because he'd fished in Labrador with his father, who was another famous Newfoundland fisherman. And so he was well known as Cy Tucker. Right. First one is my mother. Anybody that's ever seen any pictures of the family would recognize her. Well, next to her is my sister Mary, and next to her is my Aunt Sarah. And then it's her son, Lawrence. This is the latest store. This was the third store that my father had. The original one was part of the house. And then what we came to know as the new store was the one that was built after that. And then that was near the wharf. It had its limitations. And that's the one that your mother Leona would have been familiar with at first, because they knew that as the new store. On the left was Aunt Julie Eddy, my aunt, Mom's sister. And on the far right is her husband, Uncle Charles Eddy. Mom is first, and then it's Aunt Lydia and Uncle Alf. Uncle Alf was Mom's brother, and Aunt Lydia was his wife. And looking over his shoulder, Aunt Sarah. That's my father's sister-in-law. And that's Uncle Alf again, and Mom and my sister Mary. And this is Lou McCormick and Marjorie's husband, Don Collins. This is the entrance to the SUF Lodge before it was completed, Society of United Fishermen. My father was the one with the hat on. He was the master of the lodge. Next to him was Edgar Smith. This is Mom that's Michelle, that's Sharon, and that's Mary Lou. There's Mom, and there's Lou next to her. In front of Lou is my sister Mary, and then his dad, and one on the end, his brother Ken. And that's the house, of course, that I grew up in. It's not the house I was born in, but it's the one I grew up in. And up in the corner here is Elijah Lambert's house. And Elijah was a cousin, Mom's cousin. Yeah, that's brother Ken. Might be Clara. There's my sister Mary. The tower for our version of electricity was a wind charger wired to the house. Initially, that wind charger was on the roof, and there was a brake on it. It was like a shoe type brake, and you pulled that brake from down on the ground, and sometimes that would stretch. A storm or something, and that wind charger would get going, and it would almost shake the house. Would scare the daylights out of us kids. Now that's Uncle Alf and his full family. There's Grandfather Stoyles and Grandmother Stoyles next to him. And there's Uncle Alf, Aunt Lydia, and Daisy. This is Wesley, cousin Wesley. Yeah, that's Southport in early days, because that originally was the church. This was the new church. That's the United Church. That's the new church that was built. And that's the church I attended because we didn't have to go very far to attend there. And in the background was all of the various boats. That's Press. He always had nice cars. Yeah, that's Leonie's husband. Now that's an oldie, and that's his grandmother. My mother is the apparent tall one, And the short one is her sister, Aunt Julie. That's an early picture that I know. Mildred Smith, Ike's wife, her father and her uncle owned that. They fished together. And this shed here was built by Silas, who had worked on the train as a brakeman during the war. After the war, he came back home, taught school, and did some fishing on the side. And this was the shed that he built. Yeah, that's Long Beach, and then there was a small community that was later abandoned called Island Cove. Then there was Hodges Cove, Capeland Cove, Heart's Ease, then there was Butter Cove, Gooseberry Cove, and Southport.